This is a video on the Austrian school. We'll start by discussing two Austrian economists, Karl Menger and Eugen von Bauerk, and then I'll talk a little bit more generally about the Austrian school and theory of economics. In addition to these slides, I've posted a short video as optional reading, which is we watched the video in class last Friday, and it just goes in general over what the Austrian school is and what is the methodology, focusing mostly on methodology, which we will recap here. So the first economist from the Austrian school we'll talk about is Karl Menger, who many view as the father of Austrian economics. During this time period, classical economics had been held in low esteem and was viewed as too theoretical, unable to clearly explain observed phenomenon. And so what we'll see in the Austrian school is a switch away from the mathematics that had been developed during the marginal revolution, the marginalists, and towards kind of verbal and a priori deductive logic. So in the modern Austrian school, if you go to these presentations, they have an institute down at Auburn University where I did a master's degree. You find that they are often writing in words and not in equations. So we'll talk about three basic theories from the Austrian school. We'll first talk about the theory of value and how it differs from our classical theory of values in Smith and Ricardo. We'll talk about the Austrian methodology, and then we'll talk about some Austrian non-intervention beliefs. So first, starting on the theory of value, if you remember back to Smith and Ricardo, what was their theory of value? Just that you could add up the labor time used for production in some way. Smith just had labor, and then, of course, Ricardo updated it to include what we think of as capital. To the Austrians, both of these definitions are wrong. Value is actually subjective. So assuming that all trades are voluntary, it can be concluded that each party subjectively perceives the received items or whatever they received as being of more value than what they gave away. So without modifying anything, value can be created by transferring ownership from a person who values it less to a person who values it more. And then often this exchange involves money, and so the value is created in the exchange of money. The price at which a good traded is not determined by how much labor then is exerted in production or by its general usefulness, but it's determined instead by marginal utility or a subjective judgment about how much utility consuming or owning a good will give to a person. Right, so Ricardo and Smith's theory of value then must have been wrong, because we know it doesn't really matter how long it took to produce something. People seem to only care about how much they get out of it, or what will be their utility from consuming. We also see some kind of non-intervention theory here, just in terms of trade. Since trades must be productive, people wouldn't do it unless they felt the goods they received would be better than what they're giving up or worth more than the money that they're trading. And then we see just a couple of other, small topics out of here, especially the value of the marginal product definition of wages. That's something you've probably seen in macroeconomics, just that if you want to know the value of a worker, figure out the value of production, remove that worker, or remove one unit of an input, observe the loss in output. That's how much extra that last worker was able to produce. All right, so von Bauerk gives us an important theory, which we call roundabout production, which is that firms face a choice between producing in the short run now with whatever current technology we have, yielding relatively less output, or what von Bauerk calls roundabout techniques, which take longer, usually have some fixed cost, but are more efficient and will produce a higher quantity in the future. So the example von Bauerk gives is a system for drinking water. You've got some sort of well or source of drinking water. One way you could go about production is everybody could have a cup and get their own water. Right, there are other production technologies, but eventually you install some sort of piping system that goes into people's houses. It's much more efficient than everybody filling their own cup. So this is a roundabout production, but it takes some amount of time. You can't just immediately have the pipes leading to the water. You have to build them over time. And so that's what we call roundabout production. So then to Bombauer, contrary to Marx, where if there's a value created over the worker's marginal product, that's exploitation. In Bombauer, there is no exploitation, or workers are not exploited in this way, because workers are not the ones who are engaging in roundabout production. Bombauer believes it's up to the capitalist or ownership class to invest in new production technologies or to innovate. And so there needs to be some role for economic profit to encourage innovation and roundabout production techniques, which ultimately yield higher quantities of goods. Finally, a kind of a less important note, but Bombauer spent a lot of time discussing why real interest rates had to be positive, or in other words, why would a lender only lend when the purchasing power they'll get back is higher than the purchasing power that they're lending? Well, on the surface, we know that most rational people would not lend out money if they get back less purchasing power than they're lending. But Bombauer expanded on the theory. Bombauer believed that incomes were growing over time. And so because we assume that we'll make more money in the future, we should be willing to pay slightly more than $1 to get $1 today. People want goods now because the future is uncertain. You don't know how long you'll be alive or how much you'll get to consume in the future. So you want to consume now. So people should be willing to pay slightly more than $1 to consume $1 today. And finally, people might be willing to pay positive interest rates to create roundabout production processes, which increase profits. Right, so we have some discussion previous to the Austrians. A lot of the discussion about interest rates or usury as we first saw it was, should this be allowed? Do we want banks? What's the role of banks? And now the focus of discussion has shifted a little bit more to the workings of interest rates and why real interest rates are always positive. So to sort of summarize the Austrian school, just recapping the short video we watched, we talked about the subjective theory of value, contrast to Smith and Ricardo. The value or the price of things is not dependent on labor time, like in Smith and Ricardo. It is dependent on individual preferences. So the only thing that goes into market prices is how much value people will subjectively get out of purchasing and consuming the item. We see in general a focus of study on deductive reasoning, which is a lot of what the video I posted talks about. The Austrians believed in value judgments and subjective value judgments, which are difficult to compare across people. And so what you see a lot of in Austrian economics is verbal deductive reasoning, kind of following from Mill, starting with assumptions that are known to be true and gathering evidence via verbal logic. We see in the video, the Austrians do a lot of studies where they assume a world, we want to study, say, the impact of a policy. So we assume the world is all the same except for that policy, even though that world may not actually exist. And so it's this sort of like logical deduction. We also have a focus of study on individuals rather than classes, as seen in the classical literature. And then to talk a little bit about Austrian non-market intervention, down here, prices and especially inflation is one of the main concerns of the Austrian economics. And the biggest concern of the Austrians about government intervention, especially government or central bank stimulus, is that ultimately what happens is that it's increasing the money supply, which reduces interest rates. And what happens when the interest rates are artificially low is that investors think that investments are good decisions. So you can take out a loan for cheap, so you think, okay, I'll take out the loan. for example. So the Austrian concern is that when the government or central bank implement these stimulus packages, which alter the money supply, it changes the price signals within markets. So one price signal within markets would be interest rates at which you could get loans. All right, people take out too many loans, engage in too many investments. The investments aren't actually worth what they thought they were. And so we get overinvestment, ultimately leading to inflation. And so the Austrian problem in general, Austrians are very concerned about inflation in the long run, feel that there's these sort of natural business cycles, economic booms and busts which occur. And if the government intervenes too much, it will distort these business cycles, potentially making the busts even longer or making us go more quickly to the busts. It's important to note that the Austrians also felt that business cycles, economic booms and busts, were somewhat of a natural phenomenon. So there was one economist, Jevons, who had a sunspot theory of business cycles. He believed that sunspot flares led to improved growing seasons and better economic conditions. And then when there weren't sunspot flares, there were economic busts. And they were actually able to time out these periods on about similar 10-year intervals, but then ultimately evidence came out such that the sunspot theory was generally rejected. But the Austrians, just to that example, did believe that business cycles were somewhat natural, right? So that is an important part of the Austrian non-intervention. When we're at economic lows, we don't want to intervene too much because it's going to alter the way that we get back to our booms. Okay, so to summarize very quickly, 3 main topics out of the Austrians. 1, subjective theory of value, contrary to Smith and Ricardo. 2, a general methodology, which is verbal deductive reasoning. You can hear more about that in detail in the short video I posted. And then 3, non-intervention or laissez-faire economics, especially when it comes to banking and bank policy. The Austrians are very concerned about inflation due to overinvestment if interest rates are artificially low. We see some discussion of business cycles. This is coming out of business cycle theory. Austrians generally view business cycles as naturally occurring, so too much government intervention will alter that naturally occurring business cycle. Okay, in the next video, we'll talk about institutionalists.